Good day, and thank you to Family Access for the opportunity to share with you some thoughts and perspectives on this important topic of helping alienated parents and grandparents in coping with the emptiness of their circumstances. I'd like to start out today by reading to you some of the emails I received from alienated parents, individuals who are asking for help or seeking guidance. This should give you a little bit of a flavor of the issues facing them, and is a sampling of the emails I've received from parents and grandparents over the last 12 months. Here we go. Doctor, I'm an alienated parent in a high conflict situation. This is a high conflict divorce that's happening in San Diego, California. Unfortunately, my lawyer and the guardian ad litem do not understand parental alienation. The GAL has requested a psychological evaluation to be conducted by a clinical psychologist who was selected by my ex's lawyer and the GAL without my lawyer having a say. I'm desperate for help, as my ex seems to be winning with the GAL and has successfully turned 2 out of my 3 kids against me. Hello, Dr. Mosk. My husband desperately needs a therapist to help him deal with the grief associated with alienation and hopefully reunification, if it ever comes to that. Are you available to help? I want to choose the right person. Dr. Mosk, I'm in the New York area. Do you know any good clinicians for my 18-year-old daughter and or myself and or the 2 of us together to help with reunification? Dr. Mosk, my ex-wife deeply alienated our 2 children with much success despite my having full custody of them. She brainwashed my daughter over a 10-year period. Her mom is a textbook narcissist, borderline personality disorder, and a neglectful, abandoning parent. Dr. Mosk, I was an alienated mom for my son, David, who returned to live with me last year. David now wants to get more time with his dad. His behavior got so bad when with me, and with his constant anger and his stopping eating, I sent him to his dad's today. Dad emailed me what a loser I am, and he also told this to our son. I hope David will finally see and recognize the false narrative. Any suggestions on how to shape legal or mental health outcomes for him? Hi, Dr. Mosk. I'm a physician in San Francisco and also a grandfather who has been alienated from my granddaughter for the past 12 years. My daughter and I have been traumatized by a wealthy, malignant narcissist who has been convincing a very backward court system in California to believe his false allegations. He finds therapists who are biased and willing to take his side. Currently, my granddaughter's therapist sees everything through the lens of the alienator. I have also been looking for a therapist who understands alienation and have not been able to find anyone to help me navigate these very dark waters. I'm inquiring about therapy. I'm looking for help to cope with the long-standing and seemingly ever-increasing narratives of alienation. Sometimes the grief is so great that I cannot function. I also need help to know how to respond when I receive hurtful texts. Dear Dr. Mosk, my 17-year-old, very depressed, angry daughter left the house today to live with her alienating mom. My daughter's stepsister is suffering terribly with her having left. Dr. Mosk, my ex-husband filed a court motion in court today to remove my decision-making and reduce my parenting time. The whole thing is so bogus and bizarre. I need someone who can help me get the judge to see that my son has been brainwashed by his dad and his stepmom. I'm faced with an uphill battle. Dr. Mosk, I was referred to you to serve as a co-parenting therapist for my wife and me. We had an extremely contentious divorce and we're now divorced. I would like to continue to be on the same page with her, and the kids have suffered as a result. What can we do to get started? Doctor attaches a document regarding my ex-wife's recent efforts in blocking communication between me and our children. I brought these types of incidents up to the GAL and the previous lawyer, and both did nothing to help our children, as they claimed they would. Dr. Mosk, my ex definitely has the audacity to scam at every level, and thus far has duped and misled several people involved in these court cases. His lies and deception to all involved have more serious consequences, as they have damaged and impacted the lives of our children. I pray that everyone realizes this and works to reverse the damage. Doctor, this past weekend, my wife tried to coerce a neighbor to call the custody evaluator and lie about me. It's so sad how the alienator uses delay tactics with the child to further the alienation. She's had so much time to poison them, and the GAL has added years to that, and the children are getting older and more indoctrinated. My children need to be helped out of this alienation factory they are trapped in. And finally, this comes from a client to his attorney, and I was CC'd on it. And he wrote to his attorney, quote, "Not a single response from you about today's disgusting court appearance. I need to know what I need to do to cancel our agreement and stop working together. Today was such a disgusting display of legal BS. I can't get past you ignoring every attempt made by the judge for you to speak up. Stop lying to your clients. I am terminating our agreement. You let them railroad you today." All these examples scream out not only the fact that there's a very broad scope of practical impacts from parental alienation, but also the emotional impacts of parental alienation are equally devastating. Experiences of confusion and anger, hopelessness, frustration, sadness, and anxiety. And of course, the emotional impacts from these incidents affect our behavior, affect our ability to function effectively. We know that parental alienation is an extremely complex and at this point still somewhat poorly understood phenomenon by the rest of the healthcare and legal community. But to be certain, it is real, it is harmful, and it impacts the lives of many, many family members for generations. My name is Dr. Mark Mosk, and I've been a clinical psychologist now for nearly 40 years. My primary focus has been in treating difficult and resistant psychological disorders, primarily depression and anxiety. I also have very deep experience for some 35 years doing forensic work for the court in various specialty areas. My work in family law and parental alienation began about 15 or 16 years ago when I originally began working just doing assessments and then brought in my focus in providing greater clinical care to alienated family members. My clinical research interests lie in the areas of assessment of normative parenting. That is, what is normal, expected parenting across different subgroups of people, across different demographics, and especially regarding alienated families. And this mainly applies to identifying the early warning signs, the behaviors, and the very subtle processes of alienation and how to prevent that from occurring. So today's topic is coping with the feelings of emptiness. My title for this particular talk is Resurrecting Hope in the Land of the Surreal. Why the surreal? Surreal implies that it's an experience out of the ordinary. Think of surreal as similar to the emotional effects all of us have experienced during the pandemic, the sense of quarantining and isolation, where nothing that we used to know is real. And for instance, these days we now talk about the new normal, meaning that what we knew before will be no longer. It is surreal, strange, unfamiliar, and out of sync, foggy and distorted, and untrue. This is the world of alienation, the fact that individuals find themselves in a situation, circumstances where they have been abruptly and unexpectedly separated from a loved one. And the question becomes, how did I get here? What is this world like? This doesn't seem normal. The people who are supposed to help me are not doing so. And even more so, in many cases, they are interfering with my ability to have a healthy, positive relationship with a son, daughter, child, grandchild, etc. We talk today about emptiness. What is emptiness? From a clinical perspective, and as a clinician, I must answer this question because there is no such thing as a diagnosis of emptiness. Is it sadness? Is it loneliness? Is it feeling numb? Is it confusion? Is it despair? From a clinical perspective, when we talk about emptiness, It embodies feelings of depression, feelings of anxiety, and feelings of anger, understandably. It is not a feeling of necessarily being the opposite of full. There is no such thing as being full and feeling complete versus being empty. What is feeling full and what is feeling empty? Feeling fulfilled requires that we harbor certain sentiments. Feeling empty means the absence of those positive feelings. We must understand the notion of emptiness and the despair that comes with it, the feelings of sadness, that this concept lies actually on a continuum. It is not an either or. It isn't a I'm feeling fulfilled versus I'm feeling empty. Emptiness and fulfillment lie on a continuum, and emptiness lies on one end of the continuum, fulfillment on the other. In other words, there is a degree or level of a feeling of emptiness or completion and fulfillment. Therefore, when we speak about coping with feelings of emptiness and trying to reduce those feelings in ourselves, clinically or through just self-help, we are talking about trying to adjust the place that we are on that continuum to move away from the feeling of total emptiness towards and in the direction of feeling fulfilled. We have to learn to set expectations that we will simply be able to move along that continuum away from emptiness towards fulfillment. And that unto itself is a noble and a valuable and a helpful goal for each of us to have. When we attain a sense of fulfillment, we must understand as well that this is a long-term goal. Achieving satisfaction in life and meaning in life is not attainable immediately or necessarily even in the short term. It would be unrealistic to assume that there's going to be a quick fix. But as long as we can engage some tools and action steps to move away from that position of emptiness towards feeling more fulfilled, that unto itself is a valuable exercise and certainly an objective worthwhile pursuing. We must set realistic expectations for what we can accomplish and how long it might take. So coping with the emptiness, as the title of our conference indicates, coping therefore lies in the middle of that continuum between feelings of complete emptiness and feelings and the satisfaction of fulfillment. And we will learn through today's remarks, hopefully, some of the tools that are available to you to help you move in that direction. These are clinical goals, and there are specific processes that I can share with you, that I will be sharing with you, on how you can best achieve those results. Combating emptiness includes significant effort, emotional effort, and sometimes behavioral tasks that you must pursue in order to feel better. Most importantly, perhaps, is the need to reject the false narratives that you receive from others about yourself, who you are as a person, as it speaks to perhaps the false attribution given to you for why you might be alienated from a loved one. We receive these false allegations and these false narratives from others, but we also receive them from ourselves. And we'll be talking a lot about that during the course of my remarks today. How do we cope with emptiness? Most importantly, understand that this is an issue of being able to help manage your mental health. So we're going to move a little bit away from the more generic concept of coping and emptiness towards a more clinical model to help you obtain some techniques and procedures to help you feel better as you try your best to manage with the feelings of loss. Emotional and behavioral self-management, that is, How do we regulate and control our emotions, our feelings, excuse me, as well as our actions and our behaviors? How do we learn to develop effective decision-making and problem solving? How do we engage fully and effectively in life? How do we make life meaningful again? We, of course, need to reduce the negative feelings, the feelings of sadness and guilt sometimes, and upset and anger, and a feeling of debilitation even. How do we remove the feeling of profound sadness by the lack of the presence of somebody we care about and love? We will learn through our comments today how to reframe the situation in which you find yourself, how to reorganize and redefine how it is that you find yourself, how you see yourself in your current situation of trying to cope as the best you can with alienation. Through doing so, it is also important to understand that one must accept the limits that each of us has in our ability to control factors outside of our personal management and influence. In other words, we need to learn how to set realistic expectations for what we can accomplish and what we will accomplish. It further is crucial to understand that the feelings you are experiencing today do not necessarily last forever. Do understand and be aware that these feelings as well are just temporary. They will wax and wane over time, and optimally, ideally, the feelings can be eliminated in their entirety as the alienated loved one comes back into your life through a formalized process like reconciliation, or just because that's what time does. It heals the negative feelings, and people can indeed be reunified with one another. How do we transition from the feelings of sadness and despair and frustration and anger in order to achieve long-term happiness? How do we transition toward hopefulness and attain meaning in life? Well, let's define those terms. What is hope? Hope is a belief in a future you cannot yet see. Let's try to understand hope. So I turn to theologian Dr. Sachs, who writes as follows. Dr. Sachs writes about the sociologist Peter Berger, who calls hope a signal of transcendence, a point at which something beyond penetrates into the human situation. There's nothing inevitable or even rational about hope. It cannot be inferred from any facts about the past or present. Dr. Berger sees hope as an integral part of our humanity. Human existence is always oriented towards the future. Humans exist by constantly extending their beings into the future, both in one's consciousness and in one's activity. An essential dimension of this future-oriented view is hope. It is through hope that people overcome the difficulties of any given here and now. And it is through hope that people find meaning in the face of extreme suffering. Understanding meaning is also complicated. And for that, I turn to Dr. Victor Frankel, who was a survivor of the Holocaust. Dr. Frankel is very well known for his extraordinarily brilliant book on the meaning of life. Dr. Frankel writes, "The meaning of life is to be discovered in the world rather than within man, within woman, or in one's own psyche, as though it were a closed system. It denotes the fact that being human always points and is directed to something or someone other than oneself, be it a meaning to fulfill or another human being to encounter. The more one forgets oneself by giving oneself to a cause to serve or another person to love, the more human one is, and the more one actualizes oneself. There are no timelines for how long it might take you and I and any person suffering to feel better. This process is not a sprint. It is indeed a marathon. We must learn eventually to understand the cognitive parts of oneself, how we think, the cognitions that we have, and how we must change some of our actions in order to find that hope and to find meaning in the future. We want to understand the cause of emptiness from a psychological standpoint. The perception and the belief of a lack of control over the issues faced by alienated parents and being unable to strongly influence a child, an alienating parent, a legal system, etc. Our inability to have and exert the kind of control we would like is a primary cause of people's feelings of depression and anxiety that we sometimes characterize as emptiness. True, you cannot control the courts or the attorneys and other legal professionals. You cannot control an alienating parent. And for that matter, as many of you know, unfortunately, you cannot control the whims of an alienated child. However, you can control yourself. You can control your beliefs. You can control your perspectives, your views, your attitudes, and you can also control your actions. So our goal is ultimately to be able to live an emotionally satisfying life. We also want to learn to be emotionally and behaviorally prepared to facilitate a possible reconnection with and reunification with a child or a grandchild that is alienated. This last issue is one that I consistently emphasize with the parents and grandparents with who I work to help them with their struggle to cope with the feelings of emptiness. The fact remains that it always is a possibility, and ideally a strong possibility, that your current circumstances of being separate from a child or grandchild is a temporary one, and it will indeed resolve over time. We don't know if, we don't know when, but the possibility of that future always remains open, that light never dims. Consequently, one of our objectives should always be the goal of being prepared to engage in and participate in a process of reunifying with a loved one, a child or grandchild. Now, this is not an easy task, and it is not simple, in part because there is a human emotion attached with the circumstances in which you find yourself. The sadness and the anxiety often evolve into feelings of the frustration and anger. And we don't know what to do with that frustration. Sometimes it's directed inward. Sometimes it's directed solely at the alienating parent. Sometimes it's directed towards the legal system. Sometimes it's even directed towards the very person with whom you want to reconnect and reestablish a relationship with the child or grandchild. We see this especially the case in circumstances where promises are made and plans are put into place for that child to come visit, to engage in a face-to-face dialogue, to meet grandma at the restaurant for lunch, to have a Zoom meeting with your son for the first time in years. And the circumstances, given the novelty of that fact in one's life, the circumstances tend to be so unusual as if we weren't quite ready for that. that it sometimes is the case that individuals not knowing how to handle their emotions in those circumstances inadvertently find themselves becoming upset, sometimes angry, and that anger actually spilling out and overtly occurring during a meeting with a child or grandchild. And of course, the last thing we want to do is to hurt the very people that we love and want to reconnect with. Sometimes that hurt by us is expressed because the child, him or herself, is trying to still set the rules. And this happens over and over again, including during more formalized and court-mandated reconciliation and reunification efforts. When a child, for example, promises that I will meet with you and spend an hour, but they come and they spend only 15 minutes, one can understand that this might induce frustration and disappointment. And the last thing we want to do, of course, is to express that. Yet, at the same time, though, we are still human. And sometimes it's difficult to control that emotionality. One of our goals is to always be prepared to meet face-to-face or virtually with the individual with whom you are alienated and have as an outcome of that interaction and interlude an absolutely wonderful, positive, and satisfying experience for both of you. And that's one of the factors that will then likely increase the chance that that intersection and that engagement will happen again. We have to be prepared to be good at all times, despite not always feeling good and despite sometimes downright feeling miserable. How do we get help? One of the most effective ways of supporting ourselves in our emotional health and well-being is to seek social support, to build a network of individuals, friends, and family members, and sometimes even folks that start out as strangers, but turn into some lifelong healthy acquaintances and bring them into your life as a source of refreshment and encouragement and facilitating your own well-being. Individuals in your community, individuals perhaps in your extended family, individuals in your community. There are formal support groups such as our organization here today, Family Access, and others that can also help facilitate stable and stabilizing our emotional well-being. As well, there is also professional treatment that is available. If we are going to seek just self-help, which is perfectly fine and ideally the best way to start, there are a number of different techniques that we can apply and use for ourselves. One of those is called journaling, and I will speak about journaling a little bit later in my remarks today. And there are as well other depression and anxiety reducing techniques and tactics that can help you manage your emotions. We will be talking about them as well in just a little bit. Now, what I would like to do is to introduce to you a novel, and I would characterize as a crucial concept, which I bet you haven't heard before. And it's all in 3 words. And those words are: words create worlds. Let me repeat that, please. Words create worlds. What does that mean? As human beings, we have the power of language, which is, I would argue, in so many cases, far stronger and more potent than other forms of interaction with people. There are words that are delivered to us by other people. And there are words that we convey from us to other people. Our words shape and color our perspectives, and they shape and color the perspectives of those people with whom we interact and with whom we speak, to whom we speak. There are words of hope and encouragement, or there are words of hurt and destruction. Words are extraordinarily powerful, and we as human beings have the gift of language, of a complex and a rich language that can convey our feelings, our sentiments. We can bring about happiness and joy in others by providing for them words of hope and encouragement. Likewise, we can harm and we can diminish the welfare of others by speaking words of hurt and destruction to them. But it is perhaps the words that are delivered to ourselves by ourselves are the ones that are most important. We certainly can speak to others and convey thoughts and feelings and opinions and perspectives, but the words we say to ourselves are the ones that are most powerful and most important. You see, the words that we speak to ourselves, by and large, are inside our own heads. They are subconscious. We're not even aware that those words are occurring. We talk to ourselves constantly, 24/7, in the form of what we call thoughts. These thoughts, these words that we say to ourselves, are literally hardwired into our brains. The thoughts, the sentences, the phrases that we say to ourselves are a part of our ongoing psyche. And this means, of course, that these words are far more permanent to us than are the words spoken to us by others. If somebody comes up to you and speaks poorly of you, you have the opportunity to simply ignore it and dismiss it. Whether you do or not is an entirely different issue. But there is the possibility of you simply ignoring and pushing away the meaning and the value and the worth of words spoken to you by others. But when you speak to yourself, you always believe them. If you are speaking words of hope and encouragement to yourself, you're in good stead. In contrast, however, if the words you are saying to yourself are ones of hurt and are self-destructive, they can be and likely would be far more potent and powerful and harmful to you than even the words spoken by others. So we recognize that there is a need to manage what we say. When we speak to ourselves, this happens automatically and instantly and out of our consciousness. So we must learn to manage what we say to ourselves, and we also must manage what it is that we hear and what we listen to from others. Indeed, if other individuals are sharing with you words that are ones that make you feel defeated and bad about yourself, clearly we need to find strategies and tactics to avoid, to the best of our ability, the chance that it can negatively influence our attitude and influence how we feel about ourselves. And of course, the way we feel about ourselves is the way we treat ourselves. Managing what we hear others say to us is in many ways far simpler. We can simply walk away. We can simply tell ourselves that that person has no credibility, and therefore I'm not going to pay any attention to what he or she said to me. They don't know what they're talking about. Much easier to do than trying to walk away from your own thoughts in your own brain. That doesn't happen. And so therefore, the source of the possible negative self-talk is with us all the time. Our job is to be able to control what we are saying to ourselves, how we are treating ourselves, how kind we are to ourselves to help us feel better and to help us grow, to pull us out of our feelings of emptiness into feelings of optimism and fulfillment, to find meaning once again, and to find hope in our lives. Another way of characterizing this is that we need to control our environments. And we're speaking of two different environments. The external environment, the world around us, the environment in which we live, the setting, the place, the external, and the internal, the stuff inside our heads, which is much more reclusive and resistant to change. Again, we can't walk away from and avoid the person talking to ourselves, which happen to be us. We need to learn to avoid our exposure to negative talk, whether it's in the form of talk by others or self-talk. So how do we manage our feelings of emptiness? How do we manage mental health through clinical approaches? Well, we have to learn patience. We have to learn anger management skills at times. We experience a wide variety of symptoms, including anger. Those symptoms and those feelings that might constitute a sense of inadequacy, confusion, hurt, loneliness, depression may include symptoms such as feeling empty, feeling dejected, feeling beaten down, feeling worried and worthless, feeling useless and powerless. Helplessness, very common. People feel broken and desperate. They sometimes panic at the thought of not having contact with a loved one. People tend to be taken aback at times that the legal system isn't helpful. And therefore, folks can become confused and befuddled, rattled, and startled. They feel punished sometimes, scorned, and sometimes even crushed. The sadness and the dismay may lead to feelings of bitterness and feeling infuriated, sometimes even vengeful. People feel abandoned and forsaken, rejected sometimes. We must learn how to address these feelings and instill instead hopefulness, learn about the dynamics of resistance, to resist the feelings, the tendencies to submit to these negative feelings. And we also must learn that while we are working on bettering ourselves, it's also important to remember that the child from whom we are alienated has as well been negatively influenced by an alienating adult. And therefore, that loved one, that child, be he or she still a child or an adult, has been to some degree coerced, some degree certainly negatively influenced, and the child has developed some types of negative perspective, of biases against the relationship that you represent. And therefore, as one proceeds in working on oneself to learn the skills and tools to find happiness and satisfaction again, to recognize, therefore, that the alienated child too must learn how to overcome those biases. That sometimes happens through formal processes, such as formalized reunification therapy, and then sometimes through just general clinical psychotherapy. And then at other times, just based upon the fact that the child has grown and come into contact with more insight and information that clarifies the fact that you are not somebody with whom the child should be avoiding, that you are not somebody to be feared, but instead somebody with whom you can create a relationship and love. Words create worlds. This happens to be the essence of cognitive behavior therapy, which is the predominant and most widely used clinical approach to help individuals overcome depression and anxiety, meaning overcoming feelings of emptiness and feeling forlorn. Cognitive behavior therapy is a therapeutic approach that's based upon the science of cognition and the science of behavior. And at its core is learning how to recognize the words that you say to yourself. Recognize the words that you speak, your self-talk, identifying whether that self-talk is helpful or a hindrance to you and your mental health and your relationships in the world. Cognitive behavior therapy is a structured and systematic approach that we have consistently been using in the field of treating alienated parents and grandparents from the onset of the challenge of recognition of parental alienation as a concept. Our ability to help individuals reframe their understanding of who they are, of the nature of the relationship with the alienated child, and then how to change and modify the way we speak to ourselves, the words that we use to ourselves in describing to ourselves our circumstances, describing to ourselves the need for hope and the fact that hope is always present, and to use those words to change the course and direction of our lives. Words create this new world. We can live in a world in which we allow our words to remain negative and unhelpful and depressing, or we can work on creating a new world, a new world that is founded on and supported by words of encouragement, words of affirmation, words that correctly and accurately clarify what it is that we are experiencing and how we might be able to make things better. Words that precipitate feelings of hope and encouragement. And this is the essence of cognitive behavior therapy, an approach that I would strongly recommend that if any of you have an interest in seeking more formalized psychotherapy, that when you are in the process of trying to find a psychologist to help you on that journey, to keep in mind that that is a characteristic and an element of the therapy that should most certainly be included as a part of the therapeutic process. I'd like to share with you a couple of resources that you may want to consider on your journey to self-improvement, both of which relate to your ability to change how you think, change how you feel, and change the way you talk to yourself. These happen to be books that I have consistently been using in conjunction with the therapy that I provide to alienated family members. There are two books. The author of the first book, and you may want to grab something that you can write with or use your phone or computer. The first author is Dr. Shad, S-H-A-D, Helmstetter, H-E-L-M-S-T-E-T-T-E-R, who wrote the book entitled What to Say When You Talk to Yourself. The second book is by an author, Dr. David Burns, who authored a book that's entitled Feeling Great. There are earlier revisions or editions of this book that were actually entitled Feeling Good, the New Mood Therapy. But he just recently changed the title in this most recent edition that came out last fall. The book by Dr. Burns is entitled Feeling Great. Both of these books are absolutely outstanding, and I would argue and submit to you crucial resources to learn how to develop better control over the words that you say to yourself. Because as you are now aware, words create worlds. Part of this process of learning how to change how we think and what we say to ourselves, and how we overcome feelings of emptiness, and how we cope and see ourselves as capable of coping, is a concept that is integrated in cognitive behavior therapy that's referred to as mindfulness. Now, the word mindfulness has become a popular word in today's general public discourse, but it's frankly relatively poorly understood. So let me share with you a definition. The idea of mindfulness is a core concept of becoming highly self-aware. Mindfulness is a mental state that is achieved by focusing on one's awareness on the present moment, while at the same time calmly acknowledging and accepting one's feelings, thoughts, and even bodily sensations. Mindfulness is a type of meditative experience. It's not meditation per se, but it is a kin experience in which you focus on being intensively aware of what you are sensing and feeling in the moment, without interpretation or judgment, of being intensely aware of what you are thinking, what you are saying to yourself that happens to be driving your emotions. We know that what you think, what you say to yourself, is what causes you to feel the way you do. Your words give you the feelings you experience. If you're feeling poorly, then we know that we need to change the words you say to yourself. In this process of altering how we think and feel about the world, we need to learn how to reframe our perceptions, to look at the world not as necessarily black and white, because indeed the world isn't black and white. It's a vast area of gray. And we have a tendency as human beings to look at one end of the continuum or the other. Again, emptiness or fulfillment. But just like that identical analogy, that a continuum in life is what life really is. It is virtually all gray, and only at the very end, black or white. So we need to learn to reframe and readjust how we see the world and how we describe to ourselves the world. In what words, with which words do we describe ourselves and our future, and how we perceive the value and joy in life. If we perceive it as negative and we tell ourselves the world is negative, that's what we feel. If we can come to learn how to change how we see the world in a realistic and honest way, then our world becomes brighter and more hopeful. We want to learn how to create our own narratives. Again, in the world of alienation, unfortunately, there are many narratives that are presented to us, many narratives that tend to be floated around the situation that each family experiences. Some of those narratives are, again, provided by alienated parents or supporters of those individuals. Some of the narratives as well are perpetuated by the alienated children, and some of the narratives are presented by by people that we don't even know, people who are involved with us in our lives that might mistakenly understand what they think they are seeing, share those thoughts when those perspectives sadly produce nothing but misinformation and misunderstanding, leaving you, the alienated parent, feeling more frustrated. One of the greatest challenges that we have in helping alienated parents is that there is a tendency to compare. The notion of comparing your circumstances right now as an alienated individual with virtually everybody else who is not alienated from a loved one. And the reality is, of course, it isn't black and white again. We never are individuals who are experiencing great loss and assuming that everybody else is living a life of fulfillment. Family dynamics are complex. All families have challenges at one level or another. One of the greatest contributors to disappointment, and this is actually a phrase I use with my patients, I share with them that comparison is the root of all disappointment. You will never find another person who has a situation worse than yourself because you don't allow yourself that comparison. It's always you and your circumstances to somebody who you perceive having healthier and better circumstances. The role of social support, as well, I mentioned earlier, is crucial to bring about you people that love you, care about you, believe in you, and are there to have your back at all times. This brings in the role of faith, faith in others and faith in yourself. Now, I'm not necessarily speaking of faith per se from a religious standpoint, but it certainly applies. Prayer and belief and self-talk go hand in hand. When we pray, when we are praying silently, it is a form of self-talk, and it conveys our beliefs. We can have beliefs that are religiously or otherwise oriented, but also beliefs in ourselves, belief in our ability to overcome and to cope and to manage and to get better. In this process altogether, we want to avoid the unnecessary stressors that come into our lives, to minimize our exposure to things that make us anxious and feel sad about the world broadly and about our own unique circumstances. Importantly, we also want and need to learn how to forgive ourselves in addition to forgiving others. Forgiving yourself, why would we want to do that? It happens often in my practice that alienated parents kick themselves in hindsight sometimes for failing to have recognized that a process of alienation was taking place right under their noses. That they didn't realize and recognize that the alienating parent was doing things, engaging in behaviors that were aggressive, that were intentional, that were designed to cause disruption and interference in the relationship that you have with a child or grandchild. And they harbor a sense of guilt and anger towards oneself. And it's so important to forgive yourself. You and the alienated child or grandchild are not the perpetrators of the alienation. You are the victims. To the same degree that you can forgive yourself, there's also value, and I won't spend the time today, but also value on contemplating the worth in learning eventually to forgive others, those who have harmed you. We want to be able to focus as well on expressing gratitude to the world and for what we have in our lives. We have learned, and especially through the challenge of the pandemic, as a result of mass anxiety and depression that our world family has experienced for these last 18 months. We have learned through psychological research that one of the key ways of suppressing and reducing that level of anxiety is by expressing gratitude generally and broadly, by expressing thanks for what we do have. When we do so, it pulls our minds and our thoughts and our words away from thoughts of frustration. Words create worlds. We create a new internal world by changing the words we say to ourselves that embrace a feeling of gratitude for what we indeed do have. We want to learn to focus and remind ourselves for what we have accomplished, not what we have lost and are enduring. We want to focus on long-term goals, a goal of simply connecting with your alienated loved one. We can't tell the nature of what that relationship might look like down the road, but simply connecting in the beginning of reestablishing a healthy and loving relationship is the very first step towards total and ultimate reconciliation. We want to acknowledge the fact that emotional trauma has taken place as a result of this alienation process, and your feelings are valid and they're warranted. You are experiencing normal feelings in the context of an abnormal situation. So you want to feel comfortable in acknowledging the truth about your emotions, but you don't want to let them to consume you, and certainly not let them impair you in any way. So this is a long-term process. We reset our expectations, we are realistic in that process, and we learn how to manage our own emotions. We want to learn how to control our self-talk and the programming, the words that we use to tell ourselves. Be prepared for disappointments along the way, and possibly even some setbacks. Again, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with the very first step. We know that the feelings of frustration and anger can be overwhelming. I have had over the many, many years, so many patients whose anger got the best of them, and sometimes in the worst of circumstances, such as in the presence of a judge, wherein the disappointment and the sheer frustration of the circumstance got the better of them. And unfortunately, the judge perceived that behavior as the true behavior of that alienated parent, wherein that was the last thing that was true. So self-control is crucial. How do you find a therapist if that is the direction that you choose to go? You're going to look for somebody who has deep experience in the area of family law, and ideally a clinician who has experience as well in the area of child custody and custody evaluations. These are individuals who are forensically trained to learn to work in a much more demanding, high-stress clinical environment, and one where they have a tendency usually to be somewhat more objective than other clinicians. We find that the best reunification therapists, and indeed I recommend when asked about reunification therapists, the only such therapists I ever recommend are ones who have deep experience in the area of reunification. As a forensically trained therapist. Now, let me summarize very broadly, if I may. We learn to cope with the emptiness by controlling our perception of ourselves, our perception of our immediate circumstances, and our perception of the world around us. We strive to create a meaningful world through the words that we use, and we recognize that faith, belief, and hope together can bring us the joy and the deep meaning and satisfaction in life we all so desperately want. Thank you very much. It has been my pleasure sharing with you today.